Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Inequality, What Do We Know and Why Do We Care? I'm Xiaowei Xu, and I'm a Senior Research Economist at the IFS, and I'll be chairing today's session. This is the second in a series of lectures on public economics, which will run at the same time each week, so every Monday from 4 to 5 o'clock. Next week, we'll be looking at the effects of graduating into a recession. So if you're interested, please do register for that as well. And you can find last week's lecture on pensions on our website and on our YouTube channel. So what will happen today is that my colleague, Tom Wernham, will talk to you about inequality, why we as economists might care about inequality, what policy can do, what's happened to inequality in the UK, and how different measures of inequality can tell a different story. Tom will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions and answers. We'll be taking questions on Slido, so please post your questions there and vote up the questions you'd like to see answered. You can find the Slido link on the website. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Tom.
Thank you very much, Xiaowei. So as Xiaowei said, this lecture is going to be on inequality, what do we know and why do we care? So just give you a brief outline of what we're going to talk about. In part one, we're going to think about what it is we mean by inequality, and we're going to see that people are interested in inequalities in a range of different outcomes and between different units of comparison. And I'll give a couple of examples as well. And then in part two, we're going to ask why it is that we care about inequality, specifically what arguments are made for and against policy intervention in different inequalities, and what can economic research and economic theory contribute to that debate. And then in part three, one of the major contributions economists can make is contributing to measurement of inequality. So we're going to think about how it is we measure inequality and what can different measures tell us. We're going to see that many different measures, and different measures give us different insights into how inequalities change. And I think the overall message to take from this lecture is that inequality is a really complex topic. Different inequalities have changed in different ways, and different arguments for and against intervention may apply to some inequalities and not to others. So let's jump straight into what it is we mean by inequality. As I said, people are interested in inequality in a range of different outcomes. So one of those, quite a popular one, is earnings. For example, the attention given to the gender pay gap, or to pay differentials between in large firms. On the other hand, we might be interested in disposable income. So that's income from earnings, but also other sources like investments, benefits, etc., and with taxes taken away. And that's because this take-home disposable income is often seen as a proxy for living standards. Another thing we're often interested in is wealth inequality, and that's because that wealth inequality is a significant key mechanism by which other inequalities can be transmitted through generations. It's not just these material inequalities we're interested in, though. I think with the pandemic in particular, inequalities in health outcomes or well-being have come into focus. And another interesting inequality which gets a lot of attention is inequality of opportunity. And there might be one strand of thought. Some people may argue that inequalities of outcome don't matter so much as long as people had equal opportunities in the first place to achieve those different outcomes. And of course, there are many more inequalities that we might be interested in. But there's also different ways of different units of comparison when thinking about these different outcomes. So we might be interested in between group inequalities, inequalities between men and women, or people from different ethnic backgrounds or different towns and cities. On the other hand, we might be looking at inequality across the population, so-called interpersonal or inter-household inequalities, which of course raises the question of what population. So we could look at inequalities just in the UK, for example, or in the developed world, or in the whole world, and we get very different answers depending on what populations we look at. Okay, just a couple of examples to motivate the rest of the discussion. So let's start with a health one, given the attention that's received recently. So towards the beginning of the pandemic, Black people in the UK were over 4 times more likely to die from coronavirus than white people when adjusting for age. Other inequalities that have received attention in the pandemic are educational or opportunity inequalities. For example, at the beginning of 2020, 9% of children in the UK did not have access to a computer at home, according to Ofcom, which is really important for equality of opportunity, given the fact that during the first lockdown, schools were shut and much education provision was over the internet. And then an example of the inequality before the pandemic. So the wealthiest 10% in the UK, and almost 45% of the total wealth, so not far off half. Okay. And I think it's fair to say that inequality is a really controversial topic. Thinking about some of the previous elections, it's been a key dividing line between the parties, and different inequalities provoke different reactions from people. Some are seen as problematic, some aren't, and there's also huge disagreement about what should be done about them. So with that in mind, let's move on to the next section of the lecture, where we're going to think about arguments for and against intervening in different inequalities, and what really is that people think is wrong with inequalities. Now, this is a really question of what's wrong with inequality, is really complicated philosophical and moral question. And if you want a good overview of these different moral arguments, I'd really recommend this recent paper by Deborah Sachs and Stuart White, What is Wrong with Inequality? It's impossible to do justice to the whole debate here, but I'm going to give a bit of an overview to some of the key arguments. But what I'm also going to try and do is bring that back to the contribution that economic research and economic theory can make to the debate. So to start with, let's actually think about why we might not want to reduce inequality, or some inequalities. So it's not obvious, and it shouldn't be taken for a given, that all inequalities are a bad thing, and that all inequalities merit intervention. So what are some of these arguments that might be made? Well, on the one hand, it might be argued that some inequalities are actually fair or meritocratic, and they're just not a problem. So this is the idea that people who make unequal contributions perhaps should be rewarded unequally, and those inequalities that arise from that aren't problematic. A very simple case would be that some people choose to work more than others. Even imagine a world where everyone had the opportunity to earn the same hourly wage, simply because people have different preferences. Some people prefer more leisure, some people prefer more consumption, and would choose to work more hours. We would still see inequalities in earnings arising, and maybe that isn't so problematic. But on the other hand, it gets more controversial when we start to think about how fair inequalities are that aren't through choice, because people can't work because they've got to look after children, not because highly skilled people are paid much more than lower skilled people. And whilst some empirical contribution can be made to that debate, looking at where whether inequalities are through earnings or inheritances and so on, this is inherently a really difficult moral question, a question of fairness, whether differences in pay we see are actually fair. On the other hand, another sort of argument why we might not want to reduce inequality may accept that some inequalities are problematic in some way, but also warn that measures we might want to take to reduce them would also have their own negative consequences. For example, it might be accepted that some of the large differences in pay between high-skilled workers and low-skilled workers aren't fair necessarily. But if you wanted to redistribute incomes, you'd have to finance that through taxes, and that could start to drive a wedge between the wages paid by firms and received by individuals, and cause inefficiencies. So the idea is that in a perfectly competitive equilibrium, all the wages and all the prices are such that they're diverting the right numbers of people to do the right jobs by the right things, so we get market clearing outcomes. Start to drive wedges between that, and it causes inefficiency. And this is where this idea of the equity efficiency trade-off comes in. So perhaps inequality is unfair, but to reduce that unfairness, you need to reduce efficiency. Similar arguments might be that some inequalities motivate innovation or entrepreneurship, and to reduce them might stifle growth. Now, I think it's fair to say this trade-off will of course exist in some cases, but it's not a given that it will always exist. It's quite possible that some inequalities might either have been caused by inefficiencies in the market or actually go on to cause inefficiencies in the market. And we'll talk about this a bit later, but in those cases, it's possible that we could both reduce inequality and also increase market efficiency. And answering the question of when that's possible, that is a key contribution that economists can make, as we'll see. And so let's move on to reasons why people do care about inequality and why the government maybe should intervene to reduce some inequalities. And I think there's two main categories of argument, if you like. One is that some inequalities are undesirable and should be reduced because they arise from causes that are in some way problematic, unfair, unjust, and so on. On the other hand, some inequalities may warrant intervention because they have consequences that are deemed to be undesirable or problematic in some way. And I'm going to go through some examples of each of these in turn to make it a bit clearer. So let's start with one of the causes of some inequalities which might be deemed to warrant intervention, and that's historical injustice. So this is the idea that where inequalities have arisen due to discrimination or colonialism or exploitation, that is a reason why it might be imperative for the government to intervene and reduce some. So as an example that Sachs and White give, they argue that wealth inequality in the US today is to a large extent driven by inequality in home ownership. And we see significant differences between ethnicities there, precisely because in the 20th century, African Americans suffered discrimination in access to the housing market and to credit and so on. Now, in cases such as these where inequalities arise directly from past injustice, it probably seems clear-cut that there's a problem there. But even in this case, the question of what to do about them can be controversial. We can think about some policy responses that might be proposed to these sorts of inequalities, redistribution within a country, or reparations, if we're thinking about dealing with the impact of colonialism in the past, or things like positive discrimination to try and equalise the opportunities where people come from disadvantaged backgrounds. And all these sorts of policies are quite controversial. I think part of that does come down to this idea of equity efficiency trade-off again. If you're going to finance redistribution, or if you're going to have lower entry requirements for people from certain disadvantaged backgrounds, that might introduce inefficiencies in the name of fairness. There's also another reason why this is controversial, and this is because given these injustices are historical, the people who might need to finance reparations or rectification of these injustices aren't necessarily people who committed them in the first place. And if we move on to another cause of inequality which might be deemed to warrant intervention, that's market failure. And there are a few ways in which market failure might cause inequalities. One is market power. So here we have the idea that some large firms on the seller side might be able to charge a markup over their costs because they have market power, they don't face competition, and make excess profits. And these excess profits might contribute to inequalities in income and wealth because they accrue to the owners, and ownership of businesses is not evenly spread throughout the existing income and wealth distribution. It's also possible some of these excess profits will go to paying high salaries of CEOs or highly skilled workers, but perhaps not to low skilled workers. And the reference there, Delanco et al., does find evidence of increasing market power in the US and globally, which might be one explanation as to why we've seen international trends of increasing income inequality. On the other hand, we might see market power on the in the labour market on the buyer side, so monopoly power in the labour market. Economic theory tells us that if you have a small number of firms hiring labour, and they don't face much competition with other firms, they may have incentives to reduce wages and reduce employment in order to increase their profits. And that may also contribute to inequality in incomes, as workers have their wages pushed down towards the bottom of the distribution in order to increase the profits of the company owners. And the reference I've given there, Abel et al., look at monopsony power in the UK labour market, and they do find evidence of monopsony power reducing wages. Crucially, though, it looks like as if that effect is confined to workers who aren't part of collective bargaining arrangements, such as trade unions, which makes sense from an economic theory perspective. Now, other sorts of market failures that might be deemed problematic but also cause inequalities are asymmetric information, which means that some risks, such as unemployment risks or health shocks, cannot be insured privately. And therefore, in the absence of state in provision of insurance for these risks, they will necessarily cause some degree of inequality. Now, in these cases where we think that inequalities are caused by these market inefficiencies, that may lead us naturally to policy responses that target the underlying market imperfections rather than perhaps simple redistribution. So we might look at competition law for controlling monopolies, or minimum wages, or collective bargaining arrangements, or provision of healthcare, unemployment insurance, which we see quite widely. On the other hand, if those measures aren't able to go far enough, perhaps they can't be implemented, or perhaps we're worried about inequalities that have already been caused by past market failures, then we still might want to look at redistribution, in which case we're back to this equity efficiency trade-off. So that's some of the causes of inequality that some might feel warrant intervention. But now let's think about some of the consequences. Now, I think one of the simplest arguments that could be made here is that inequality is somehow directly harmful to people's welfare. And there's a few ways we can think about this. One might be that people simply have, pure preferences for equality. They prefer a world in which there is more equality rather than a world in which there is less. So I think in this sort of case, we can think about inequality essentially entering the utility function. So I've put an example here, the inequality aversion utility function from Lorenz Smith. And this is the utility function representing the preferences of agent I. And if we imagine the x's are incomes, we can see that agent I has preferences over their own income, which is natural. They want more income. But they also have preferences over the incomes of the other agents, J, the other n-1 agents in this case. So we can see here there is a term here preceded by the alpha coefficient. This is disutility that the agent I gets whenever other agents have more income than them. You could potentially think of it as an envy term in the utility function. On the other hand, this second term preceded by the beta. This is disutility that agent I gets when other agents have less income than them. Maybe it's a sort of a guilt term, as it were, or maybe these two terms together represent agent I's preferences for social justice and so on, equality more generally. Also, this is only one specific example. Inequality can enter the utility function in many ways. But if we want to evaluate whether this is true, this is the sort of thing that can be researched, could be done through polling, simply asking people about their preferences on inequality, or you could have behavioural experiments. And I've got an example there of a paper by Stephanie Stancheva, which reviews some of these sorts of experiments, looking at how people's preferences for inequality depend on their incomes, what information they have, and so on. So this is the sort of thing that's testable empirically. On the other hand, there may be a more deeper and more complicated way in which inequality can be harmful for welfare. And one way I think thinking about this is the capabilities approach to relative poverty, popularised by Amartya Sen and Nathan and others. This is the idea that in order to achieve a given absolute standard of well-being, whether the resources you need to do that depend on the resources held by the rest of the population. For example, we could think about social standards social expectations to furnish your home in a certain way or decorate it or own a certain model of car and so on. Or we could think about maybe the rise in ownership of computers and phones and tablets and so on. Bring us back to our example earlier as well. So if you live in a world where the majority have access to computers, and society will start to be geared towards them, and those who can't afford computers will be left behind. We saw that potentially with provision of education over the internet during the first lockdown, which would be at the expense of people who couldn't afford it. And in these cases, the people at the bottom of the distribution who aren't able to afford to meet certain social standards, social expectations, are worse off than in a world where nobody could afford these things possibly, because they're being excluded. So that's the other way in which inequality may be considered harmful to welfare. Now, I think in both these cases, we can actually think of inequality as an externality. If I'm going for a high-paying job, I'm not necessarily going to think about the impact that will have on patterns of inequality and how that may affect other people's welfare. So there's an external effect to my actions that I'm not considering. And clearly we couldn't have a private market for reducing inequalities. So this is another potential argument for intervention, and might be a way in which we can increase fairness and efficiency if we think the inequalities are unfair. And then I'll just briefly mention a couple of other things. Another consequence of inequality that may mean we want to intervene is that it may harm the democratic process, for example, a more indirect effect. So it might be that you need, rich people find it easier to stand for election, or that donations give disproportionate influence to some people over the policy-making process. And these impacts of inequality on the democratic process may be enough for some people to warrant intervention to reduce them. Another argument, and it's more of a circular argument, is that inequalities today might cause more inequalities tomorrow. Inequalities in income may cause inequalities in wealth in future generations. But also, I think it's an interesting point, today's inequality of outcome could lead to tomorrow's inequality of opportunity. And this is a interesting comeback to this idea earlier that it's inequality of opportunity that matters. It's hard to imagine a sustainable system over time where each generation had equality of opportunity, and yet there were vast differences in the outcomes, because clearly, if narrow sections of society are accumulating wealth, that's going to influence the opportunities of the next generation. Okay, so that's the end of my summary of these arguments. As you can see, it's a hugely complex debates to be had around inequality, and many of them hinge on moral values and judgments about what is fair and so on. However, I think that almost all of these arguments also rest on factual claims about how the world works, so about where inequalities come from, or what their consequences are, or how effective policy measures might be at reducing them. And it's in these empirical questions that I think economists have a real opportunity to contribute to the debate. That won't be able to provide us with an answer to the questions, but it will allow us to judge the different arguments on their merits and really avoid the focus the argument on the fairness questions if we can establish the facts. That's the contribution I think can be most effectively made by economists. And in that vein, we're going to look at one of those contributions, which is actually to measure inequality. We need to measure inequality before we can work out or not. And I'm going to introduce a range of methods that economists and statisticians might employ to measure inequality in different sorts of outcomes. So first, but not for long, we're going to think about between group inequalities. This is inequalities between the genders or people from different ethnic backgrounds and so on. So one very simple thing you can do here is simply compare two groups and compare the average outcomes between them. For example, if we think back to our COVID mortality example, you could take, say, all the over 80s and compare the mortality rates of Black people and white people. Fairly straightforward exercise if you have the data. But we often might want to do more than this, and that's because lots of these inequalities have many dimensions to them. What do I mean by that? Well, it might be that Black people are more likely to die of coronavirus than white people. I mean, it is. But there may be other factors that are also relevant, such as household composition, poverty, where people are from, their age, their previous health, all these different things. And these may correlate with ethnicity to some extent. And that doesn't take away from the importance of the inequality, but it does complicate the picture because these different inequalities between groups can overlap, and it's hard to disentangle these effects. The one thing that can be done, and was done by the ONS when they calculated that figure earlier, is to do a regression that includes all of these different factors. So, for example, the ONS regressed the probability of dying from COVID on not just ethnicity that is here, but also a range of these other controls, which I talked about earlier. And you remember I said that if you adjust control for age, Black people are 4 times more likely to die of coronavirus than white people. But if you include all these other controls, there's still a large difference, and they still find that Black people are twice as likely to die of coronavirus as white people. And so really what this regression allows you to do is compare like for like. So if you take people of a similar age, similar deprivation level, similar household composition, then what is the average difference that we will see between ethnicities? Okay, but now for the rest of this section, I'm actually going to think about interpersonal inequalities across the whole of the population rather than between group inequalities. And as an example, I'm actually going to use household income in the household disposable income in the UK, and we're going to see how different measures can tell us different things about income inequality. So one good way of illustrating inequality is with the Lorenz curve. So let me explain what the Lorenz curve is. I want you to imagine lining everybody in the population up from poorest to richest, lowest income to highest income, and ask what is the total income earned by all these people, everyone in the population. Then I want you to imagine moving along this line from the lowest earning end to the highest earning, and keeping a running total of the income as you go. And then if you plot that running total as a proportion of the overall total income, that gives you the Lorenz curve. So this is the Lorenz curve for disposable income in the UK. So how do we read this? Well, what the Lorenz curve here tells us is that the 25%, bottom 25% of people receive about 10% of the income, whereas the bottom 50% of people receive about 25% of the income. Okay, and that's a mathematical expression of what I just said if you're interested. Now, if you imagine a perfectly equal society in which everyone had the same income, then clearly, trivially, the poorest 20% would receive 20% of the income, the poorest 30%, 30%, and so on. And our Lorenz curve would actually be this straight line from 0, 0 to 100, 100. This is the perfect equality line. And if we look at how far away our Lorenz curve is from the perfect equality line, that starts to give us a way of comparing inequality between different distributions already. So the further away the Lorenz curve is from the equality line, the more bowed out it is, the more inequality we have. Just as illustration here, this blue line illustrates a society with more income inequality. And actually, straight from this graph, we can start to read one of our headline statistics that we often see when thinking about inequality, and that's the Genie coefficient. So if you take the area between the perfect equality line and the Lorenz curve, and you call it A, and then take the area between the Lorenz curve and the axis and call it B, then the Genie coefficient is quite simply the area A over the total area A plus B. So if we imagine our perfect equality case where everyone has the same income, then the area A is 0 because the Lorenz curve is on the perfect equality line. And so we have a Genie coefficient of 0 for perfect equality. On the other hand, imagine a society where no one had any income at all except the richest person who had all the income. And maybe we could call this our perfect inequality case. In that case, the area A is the entire area between the perfect equality line and the axis, and B is 0. And our Genie coefficient is 1. So 1 is the case of perfect inequality. And as long as we don't have any negative incomes, our Genie coefficient is bounded between 0 and 1. So that is our first headline measure of inequality. That's an alternative formulation for it if you're interested. It's equivalently can be thought of as the mean deviation between all possible pairs you could pick, standardized by the average. Now, the advantage of the Genie coefficient is it's a good measure that takes account of the whole of the income distribution. And it has a fairly intuitive derivation if you're willing to take the time to look at it. But it is only a summary measure. So you could have quite differently shaped income distributions that gave you the same Genie coefficient. But on the other hand, you can also have income distributions that are fairly similar, but have quite different Genie coefficients just because there are some changes going on at the very top of the distribution. That's because the Genie coefficient is very sensitive to extremes. It really is a measure of how concentrated income is towards the extreme end. And that's becomes problematic really when we want to estimate it, because often we will estimate the Genie coefficient using survey data. But if Jeff Bezos answers your income survey one year and not the next, you're going to get very different answers, even though not much has changed. And you don't want small changes just from your sampling to have drastic influences on the statistics you calculate. So we do need to make adjustments if we're going to calculate the Genie coefficient from survey data. Okay, so let's look at what the Genie coefficient can tell us about UK disposable income. So I'm going to plot the Genie coefficient since the 1960s. And what we can see is that in that period, over the last 60 years or so, there has been a significant increase in inequality on the Genie measure, but that this really was concentrated in the 1980s, which, as I'm sure everyone knows, is a time of significant economic change in the UK and internationally. Changes to trade unions, the tax and benefit systems, large structural changes to the economy. But since the 1980s, there's been very little change, really. Perhaps a small uptick, if anything, up to the financial crisis, and then not much going on since then either. So yes, we've got this story of a significant increase in the Genie coefficient in the last 60 years, but primarily concentrated in the 80s. And that has taken, that increase has taken the UK towards the top of the league table when considering high-income developed countries. But the Genie coefficient is, as I say, is not the only measure we should look at, and there are other measures as well. Now, one, which I actually alluded to earlier when talking about wealth, is calculating income shares or wealth shares. And this is something we can illustrate on the Lorenz curve. So if we look, say, at the 90% level, we can say that the poorest 90% receive just over 70% of the income. And from that, obviously, the top 10% receive just under 30% of the income. And that's what we mean when we talk about income shares. We can also do it for the top 1% and see they receive 9% or so of the income. So income shares are good for understanding inequalities specifically at the top. So they focus on a specific part of the distribution. So they don't tell you everything, but it may well be inequality at the top that you are particularly worried about. If that's what you're researching, or if you think that has particularly adverse consequences that other inequalities might not. So it depends on your purposes, but income shares are one very good way of summarising a particular type of inequality. But again, just as with the Genie, it can be quite hard to estimate these if you're using survey data because of difficulties in capturing incomes at the very top. Another measure, which we normally use to focus on the middle of the income distribution, is percentile ratios. So I'll show you how we calculate those. This time I'm going to plot our income distribution in a slightly different chart. So I'm going to plot income percentiles. So what do these mean? Well, again, imagine we've got everyone lined up in order of how much income they earn, and you're moving along the line. Once you get 10% of the way along, you ask whoever's there, how much income do they earn? They'll tell you about £250. 50% of the way along, they'll tell you a little over £500. And we plot this on a graph. And percentile ratios, quite simply, you take the ratio of the percentiles that you're interested in. So, as I said, the 10th percentile, you have about £250 per week in income. The 90th percentile, a bit over £1,000 a week, and that gives us what we call a 90-10 ratio of 4. 90th percentile receives 4 times the income of the 10th. On the other hand, if we look at the 90-50 ratio, we see a ratio of about 2. So that's percentile ratios, and we can use these to summarise inequality at different parts of the income distribution. You can choose which percentiles you use, and these are usually focused on the middle of the income distribution. And I mean middle in quite a broad sense. It could be the middle 80%, but looking at what's going on in the bulk of the population without reference to what's going on at the extreme ends. And just in case you're interested, but don't worry about it, but you can also see percentile ratios on the Lorenz curve. So if you take the slope of the Lorenz curve, 90th percentile, and the slope at the 10th, the ratio of the slopes, that also gives you your percentile ratios. Okay, and let's see what these measures tell us. Well, start with our 90-10 ratio, actually not too different to the Genie, a significant increase over the last 60 years, mostly concentrated in the 1980s. Perhaps you can tell a little bit of a story, a bit of a decrease since, but really not very much. Most of the action again going on in the 80s. But on the other hand, if we plot the top 1% share, we get quite a different story. We still see stability in the 60s and 70s, an increase in the 80s, but that increase really carried on through the 90s up until the financial crisis. And that's something that isn't obvious at all from looking at other measures of inequality. So while the Genie and 90-10 ratios tell us a story of fairly flat inequality since the 80s up to the financial crisis, the top 1% share tells us quite a different story. And it's only since the financial crisis that that measure has started to stabilise a bit. And then I'm going to give one final measure, and that's actually relative poverty. So perhaps it's not always thought of as a measure of inequality, but it is. And let me show you what we mean by relative poverty. This is how it's defined usually. So if we take our percentiles of the income distribution again, we ask what is the median income, the 50th percentile. And we see that's about a little over £550. And then we ask what is 60% of that. That gives us £330. and we asked what proportion of people receive beneath that level. And that proportion, about 18–19%, that gives us our poverty, our relative poverty rate. And I showed you just on disposable incomes before subtracting housing costs, but we can also calculate this measure after subtracting housing costs, and it's a matter of controversy what's the best. But either way, relative poverty defines the fraction living below 60% of contemporaneous median income is essentially a measure of inequality, and it's a measure of lower end inequality. So I think this is it's a good measure. It's an interesting measure because it's a particular type of inequality that we might be interested in. Perhaps it gets this idea that I was talking about earlier with the capabilities approach, that sufficiency for an individual standard of living is it really depends on what the rest of the population has. So it's almost a proxy for that sort of idea. But I think there's a word of warning that needs to be made here, and that's that really this 60% measure is an arbitrary cutoff. And indeed, when we're talking about top income shares, percentile ratios, the numbers we choose, they're arbitrary as well. But it's important to remember that if you're using these measures to evaluate the impact of the policy, because you wouldn't want to focus just on relative poverty. Relative poverty, that a measure that changes the incomes just of people who are already below the poverty line, or of people who are further up the distribution, that's going to have no impact on the relative poverty rate, even though it might have significant distributional consequences, including on the people that you're interested in. So while relative poverty is an interesting summary measure of lower end inequality, it's not something that you want to focus on in isolation if your aim is to evaluate policy. And if we look at our relative poverty rate in the UK, and this time I have deducted housing costs, and we can see not too dissimilar picture to many of our other measures. Stability towards before the 80s, significant increase in the 80s, bit of a downward trend up to the financial crisis perhaps, but only a partial reversal of the increase we saw in the 80s, and then stability since then. Okay, so just to summarise, we've seen that there are various measures of inequality we can use. If we're looking at between group inequality, you can do simple comparisons of group averages, or you can run a regression to disentangle the various different groups that we see inequality between. Whereas if you're looking at interpersonal inequalities, you've got lots of measures you can use. The Genie coefficient, top 1%, 10% shares, percentile ratios, relative poverty, and I gave you the example of income, but really, well, perhaps with these top three at least, you can apply these to any outcome you like. You can apply it to wealth, consumption, any outcome that you're interested in the inequality of. Okay? And different measures give us different insights, but on all measures, income inequality in the UK has increased in the last 60 years. Okay, so let's just wrap up. We'll see that people are concerned about a huge range of inequalities, a range of different outcomes. And the arguments we can see for or against reducing inequality, and in particular the state taking action to reduce inequality, whilst they depend on moral values and claims about fairness, they're also contingent on factual claims about inequality's causes and consequences, and of the consequences of policy. And these can be evaluated by economists. Now, there are many ways of measuring inequalities, and different measures could give us different inequalities different insights into how inequalities have changed. And as we've just seen, inequality has increased in the UK in incomes in the last 60 years. But apart from at the very top, most of this change in inequality happened during the 1980s. There's been fair amount of stability since then, except for the top 1% who really have continued to hurt the way all the way up until the financial crisis, when incomes started to stabilise. Okay, so that's all from me, and I'm now able to take questions. Keep posting your questions to Slido. So I'll stop sharing and back to Shawi.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Tom. Yeah, so we've now got some time for questions. As Tom said, please do post your questions on Slido and vote up the questions you'd like to see answered. I see that we've got a couple of questions, but I think we should have time for more than this. So the top rated question at the moment is how income inequality in the UK compares to other countries internationally.
Okay, yeah, so I did mention this briefly, and if we think about the Genie measure, so one of our headline measures, and if we focus on other wealthy developed countries, the UK really is actually quite high. It's towards the top. I think it's really only the US that stands out above the UK, but the UK does stand out as well. If we think about the top 1% share, then again the UK is fairly high up the international league table if we look at similar countries, but I would say it doesn't stand out quite as much. It's still closer to the massive countries as opposed to the US, which really it does stand out on that measure as well. So yeah, but overall I think it's fair to say, looking at similar countries, that income inequality in the UK is quite high.
Great. Another question we have is on data. So there's a question on how we get the data that feeds into these inequality graphs, and whether the quality of that data has got better or worse over time.
It's an interesting question. So you could essentially divide the data we could use into two categories. So it's administrative data and survey data. So administrative data is data that the government or other authorities will hold for operational purposes. So, for example, HMRC might know people's earnings, and that data is very useful in that it is very comprehensive. It should include everybody or almost everybody. But disadvantages of using that sort of data are that, there's limits to what we can know from it. They won't hold information on performance characteristics, so they only hold information they need to know. And also it can be very difficult for researchers to get their hands on that data sometimes. So the alternative is survey data. Now with survey data, the disadvantage is you're relying on a sample. You're hoping that sample is going to be representative, or you can adjust it so that it becomes representative, and you might not get that right. However, you can ask a much broader range of questions, and if we're interested in inequalities between different groups, for example, different characteristics, then that's when survey data really comes into its own into understanding these trends. In terms of how quality of data has changed over time, well, I'd say that there's been lots of research going on into how we can use the data we've got better. So I've mentioned there's difficulties in understanding what's going on at the top. It's hard to measure top incomes and capture those. So there's lots of research going on to try and develop better ways, better techniques of dealing with that issue. And also all the time we get large new surveys introduced. For example, since about 2006, I think we've had a wealth and asset survey, which has helped us look at wealth inequality. So new surveys appearing, and that really helps as researchers as well.
That's great. Yeah, I might just add to that sometimes we also try to combine these data sources. So, for example, we know that top incomes and people earning very high levels are underrepresented in survey data. So we might use administrative tax data to adjust for incomes at the top. I think in terms of trends over time, one thing that we are aware of is that if you use tax data from the UK, of course you're capturing incomes that are reported to UK's tax authorities, and if people are perhaps increasingly using tax havens to channel their funds, then it might be that we're missing part of that data. So I think there's been some work done at LSE on how much wealth or income we might be missing through those channels. And there's a related question to this question on data on informality. So I think this is referring to perhaps earnings in the informal economy. So the question is, how do we factor in informality when measuring inequality?
Yeah, it's a very important question, and I think here this is an example of when administrative data is unlikely to be very helpful. These are precisely this sort of arrangements where, for example, HMRC won't know about the earnings that are being received potentially. So in these cases, we're probably going to rely on surveys of some description, but even then, it may well be difficult. These earnings in informal arrangements might not be measured very well, or people may not disclose them even just in a survey. So yeah, I think it is a valid point that it is quite difficult to factor in informality when measuring these inequalities. But at the end of the day, if there is a way of doing it, it really is important to consider it, because if it's income inequality we're considering, then we need to know about incomes from as many sources as we can. It's just a matter of overcoming the informational limitations there are.
Yeah, and perhaps in these circumstances, measures of consumption inequality could be used to sort of supplement the income data.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Yeah, I think consumption inequality is. I mentioned in the lecture that income inequality is often thought of as that incomes are often thought as a proxy for living standards, but they're not the only proxy we have available. One problem with using incomes is that incomes can vary quite a lot over the lifetime. People don't tend to have much income when they're very young, for example, or when they've retired, they might have less than when they were working. But consumption we might think of as an alternative proxy, because people might smooth their consumption a bit more over time. So they may borrow when they're younger, for example, as a student. They may save some of their income when they're working, and then divest their savings in retirement. So these other measures are also using different proxies for living standards is another, definitely, I agree, another way of getting at this issue.
Great. So there's one final question on COVID-19. So what COVID's done to inequality. So I guess you've already talked to, some results on inequality and mortality by race, but maybe you could talk to some other forms of inequality. So for example, what's happened to inequality in incomes, maybe between the rich and poor, the young and old, men and women, that sort of thing.
Yes, so it's a really obviously topical question, and it's because it's such early days, really, in terms of getting data on this, it's hard to answer it definitively. But really, thinking about disposable income, the evidence so far is that there hasn't been drastic changes to the income distribution as a result of COVID. Even though there were obviously significant shocks to the labour market and people's employment, and that differed between different groups quite substantially. We've seen huge government spending in terms of the furlough scheme, self-employed income support scheme, universal credit, and which really it does look like have helped to smooth out some of these shocks. And since then, as these schemes have been wound down, we actually haven't seen the big permanent shocks to employment that perhaps we might have been fearing. So I wouldn't say there's been drastic changes so far in terms of incomes, but that really is only so far. We don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. For example, lots of people were out of work for long periods during the pandemic. They had less work experience, less opportunities for training, and that may have so-called scarring effects. So in the future, they may become less productive, and that may hurt earnings. Another long-term consequence, which I think is really important, is education inequalities. And again, I alluded to them very briefly, but children from different backgrounds have very different educational provision available to them during the pandemic. And we have seen correlations between parental earnings and socioeconomic background of these children, how much remote education they got during lockdowns. And that could have in the much longer term consequences for earnings inequality as well. We know that children's earnings often correlate with what their parents earn, and that could become even more true if lower earning children had a stronger negative effects to their education from the pandemic than children from higher earning backgrounds. So that really here we need to watch what policies the government uses to try and compensate for education lost during the pandemic, if we're going to get an answer to that question.
So we've got another question that's related to this idea of intergenerational transmission. So it mentions that many of the measures you've used so far relate to income, but you know, what evidence is there on wealth inequalities, and in particular measures related to inherited wealth?
Yeah, so there has been work looking at wealth in general and inherited wealth, and there's lots of mechanisms by which wealth inequalities persist between the generations. Now, clearly, direct inheritances are a very big component of that, but we can also see that there are correlations between children's earnings and parental wealth, or you know, where children are educated, savings behaviour, all sorts of factors as well. And so I encourage whoever asked that question to search the IFS website for, I think, a fairly recent paper a few months ago, which covered some of that in more detail. But yeah, there is evidence. Inheritance is definitely important, but it's not the only driver of wealth inequalities and how they persist over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some IFS work, maybe it was the same paper, also found that inheritances are becoming an increasingly large driver of wealth inequalities between people of the same generation, in that, you know, younger people are building up wealth more slowly, so the inheritance they get from their parents is becoming a larger share of their wealth, and therefore differences in the level of that inheritance is driving inequalities in wealth more than before.
And I would also add on the wealth point, that is another impact of the pandemic that we have been able to see already. There have been huge changes to the wealth distribution, partly driven by changes to property prices. We've seen big increases in housing prices in particular, also due to increases in global equities. And I think what the pattern we've seen there is that the wealth of the middle and the top of the pre-COVID wealth distribution has increased, especially in the middle, whereas those at the bottom of the distribution haven't really seen much gain in wealth at all as a result of the pandemic. So that is another pandemic-related inequality, which we do know something about, which is an increase in wealth inequality, but in particular, perhaps lower-end wealth inequality.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom. Well, we've run out of questions on Slido, and I think we've just about run out of time as well. So I think we'll end here. Just a reminder that this is a series of lectures on public economics, and next week we'll have another lecture, Monday, 4 to 5 p.m. on the effects of graduating into a recession. So don't forget to register for that if you're interested. So I guess I'll leave it here. Thanks very much for tuning in, and thanks very much, Tom, for presenting.